Good evening, everyone. Very good, very good. My name is Phil Martin. I'm the chair of the Department of Kinesiology, and I'm very happy to welcome you tonight. I'm pleased to also have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ai-Min Lee, the 2016-17 Dean Helen LeBaron Hilton Endowed Chair in the College of Human Sciences. Before I introduce Dr. Lee, I think it's appropriate to thank the College of Human Sciences for their support through the Hilton Endowed Chair, essentially the Hilton Endowed Chair, and our lecture series, and to comment briefly on Dean Hilton's legacy. Helen LeBaron Hilton served as the Dean of the ISU College of Home Economics from 1952 until 1975. Throughout her career, she was recognized as a visionary leader in home economics and as an advocate for the advancement of the status of women and the well-being of children. She was the first chairperson of the National Association of Administrators of Home Economics and was one of the first members of the American Home Economics Association Foundation Board of Trustees. President Dwight Eisenhower, that's one of our early presidents for you young folks here, back in the 50s, appointed her to the National Committee of the 1960 White House Conference on Children and Youth. And at the request of President John Kennedy, she served on a panel of consultants on vocational education for the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Her bequest of $1.4 million funds the Hilton Chair Endowment, which each year allows one of the College of Human Sciences departments to bring a distinguished colleague or colleagues to campus to interact with faculty and students. And it is the Hilton Chair Endowment that has made tonight's event possible. Dr. Lee is the 22nd Hilton Chair. So let me turn our attention to Dr. Lee. She is a professor of medicine in the Harvard Medical School and professor of epidemiology in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's also an associate epidemiologist at Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital. Simply stated, Dr. Lee is one of the best known, most productive, and most influential research scholars regarding the role of physical activity in promoting health and preventing chronic disease. Dr. Lee is currently involved in two major long-running research projects funded by the National Institutes of Health. The College Alumni Health Study, which is a prospective cohort study of predictors of chronic disease among 70,000 alumni from Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. That dates back to the 1960s. And the Women's Health Study, examining cardiovascular disease and cancer risks among another very large group of individuals, 40,000 female health professionals. Dr. Lee and her colleagues have been continuously funded by NIH, specifically the National Cancer Institute and the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute since 1999. Dr. Lee has served on several national and international advisory panels addressing physical activity and health, including the NIH Consensus Development Panel on Physical Activity and Cardiovascular Health, the 1996 Surgeon General's Report on Physical Activity and Health, the 2008 Physical Activity Guidelines, and the 2010 World Health Organization Global Recommendations on Physical Activity for Health. As the 2016-17 Hilton Chair, Dr. Lee will return to ISU in the spring semester for more interactions with faculty and students. But first, tonight's presentation. I think you will enjoy Dr. Lee's presentation entitled Physical Activity, Wonder Drug for Chronic Disease Prevention. Help me welcome Dr. Ai-Min Lee.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased and delighted to join you this evening, and I'd like to thank the College of Human Sciences and particularly the Department of Kinesiology for inviting me to come to speak with you tonight. This is the first time visiting Iowa State, and you have a beautiful campus. So I'm going to talk about physical activity, and I've titled my talk, Physical Activity, Wonder Drug for Chronic Disease Prevention. And you all thought you were going to have an easy time here, but I'm going to start you all off with a test. Okay, this doesn't seem to be... All right, let's try that. Okay, I'm showing you two pictures, a woman and a man, and it's a little bit dark, but I think you can see that. They're actually not born in the same year, but in these photographs at least, they're the same age. So you can see this lady's on the track running, and this gentleman is playing tennis. Okay, takers, how old do you think these individuals are in the photograph? 80, 85, 89, 90, 91. You guys hear 100? So, okay, 91, anybody higher than 91? 99. Going once? Going twice? 100? Yes. 100? Yes. Jackpot. So, these individuals were actually 100 years old in these photographs. The lady is a lady called Keeling, and some of you may have read about her. She ran the pen relays earlier this year, where she set the record for the 100-meter race. She already holds the record for the 95 to 99. She didn't have an easy life. She had two sons who died in drug-related incidents. But she had a daughter who was very encouraging, and at the age of 67, her daughter suggested she go for a mini run. She went for a mini run and she found, hey, I like this. And she continued running, and here she is running at the age of 100. This gentleman, Roger Gentino, I have a particular fondness for because he comes from my home state of Massachusetts. He lives in the southern part of the state, and he was a textile engineer. He also never really did sports till he retired. And then he took up tennis when he retired. And he found he was very good at tennis and actually won a lot of medals in national senior games, European senior games. And you see all these medals on his neck. He died at 102 after a short illness. And he was actually very popular wherever he went around. Why? Because in most of his circles, sorry guys, the guys are all dead. Women live longer, but the guys are all dead. So he was really popular among the ladies. So, yes, they were playing sports at 100 years old, and I'm not so naive to believe that, if we all go out and exercise, we'll live till 100. Of course, they had good genes, but I strongly believe that their engagement in physical activity helped to keep them vital and active and engaged in society into triple-digit ages. So this is what I'm going to talk about this evening. I wish I could say I invented the term wonder drug, but I'm not the first person to say it. If you look in the news, you'll see that a lot of people have referred to it under various terms, like wonder drug, miraculous cure. So this is the New York Times earlier this year. It says, the closest thing to a wonder drug, try exercise. This was published by the United Kingdom last year, and it was actually from the Academy of Royal Medical Colleges, where it was a paper put out to physicians telling them that, hey, you need to talk about physical activity more. Physical activity is very important for treating diseases, and it's stated in the paper, but it is even more important for preventing long-term chronic diseases. This is a report from WebMD a few years ago, where there was a study looking at exercise and its benefit on survival in cancer patients. And this article called Exercise, a Wonder Drug for Cancer Survival. So this evening, and I promise not to run over, there are three things I'd like to talk about. First, what is it that kills us in this country, and how can we reduce our risk of dying early from these diseases? Now, obviously, physical activity is one of those things that we can do. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is how much physical activity do we need for health? And finally, I'm going to show you some scientific evidence that supports the assertion that physical activity is indeed a wonder drug for chronic disease prevention. So let's get started. What kills us and how can we reduce our risk of dying early? Now, I don't expect you to see a lot in this slide, which is very busy. I just want you to see certain patterns in the slide, and I'll point those out to you. So this is a chart showing the top 10 causes of death in the United States from the 1900s over the next 100 years. The first thing you'll notice is look at these bars. The height of the bars tells you the death rates. So the higher the bars, the higher the death rates. The lower the bars, the lower the death rates. So you can see that over the last 100 years, the bars have gone down. And we do know that because if you look at the life expectancy of individuals, at the beginning of the 20th century in 1900, the life expectancy was 46 years old for a male and 48 years old for a female. Today, what is it for us? If you are a male born this year, you can expect to live to the age of 77. If you're a female, you can expect to live to the age of 82. So great, we've definitely increased our longevity over this period of time. And why has this occurred? This has occurred primarily because we've got better medicines, better treatments for diseases. Some of the diseases that killed us in the past, such as infectious diseases, no longer occur. But over this period of time, the pattern of diseases has also changed, such that it makes physical activity all the more important. So the causes of death, if you look at these top 10 causes of death, I just want you to look at the colors. So if you look at these greeny shades are all infectious diseases. And you can see that at the beginning of the 20th century, infectious diseases, things like flu, pneumonia, killed most people. And here is the same thing, but shown, it's a line graph instead of a bar chart. You'll see this huge peak. And some of you may remember 1918, that was when the influenza epidemic occurred, where 20 million people died throughout the world. So this is the influenza epidemic. And nowadays, if you look, you can see that the greeny shades have all gone. Instead, you see gray and purple shades. And the gray and purple shades are heart disease and cancer. In fact, heart disease and cancer today are responsible for about 48% of all deaths that occur. So what can we do about this? Excuse me. Everything your grandmother told you is what you should do. Avoid smoking. Be physically active. And we'll talk more about this in a second. Eat a healthy diet. And if you do drink alcohol, do so in moderation. Maintain a healthy weight and get enough sleep. So I said I'm going to make you all work. So this is our next test question. So we said smoking and lack of physical activity are important causes of the chronic diseases that occur throughout the world. So I'm going to give you three options. We said smoking and physical activity are important in the world, but exactly how important are they relative to each other? So your first choice is smoking kills more people each year throughout the world than does lack of physical activity. Your second choice is lack of physical activity kills more people throughout the world than does smoking. And finally, the last option is they kill about equal numbers of people. Okay, so option one, raise your hand. No takers? Option two, raise your hand. Option three? So I'm going to say option two wins out. I love this audience. But unfortunately, the correct answer is actually option three. Each year, about equal numbers of people die throughout the world because of smoking or because they lack sufficient physical activity. So this is some work that we did about 4 years ago. We all are a converted audience. We believe in physical activity, but the rest of the world probably doesn't pay too much attention to it. Once every 4 years, you might do so. Why? Because the Olympic Games are on. So in 2012, the Summer Olympic Games were being held in London. And we decided to work with the leading medical journal in London, which is The Lancet. And this was an international effort that included 33 researchers from 16 countries throughout the world. And what we did was we painstakingly calculated using what data were available from different countries throughout the world. And we came to the conclusion that each year, about slightly over 5 million. 5.3 million people throughout the world die because they don't have sufficient physical activity. And we know that each year, about 5 million people throughout the world die because of smoking. So there's lots of money, lots of attention being placed towards stopping smoking. I think there's less of an effort being placed towards physical activity, and yet they're equally important as risk factors for chronic disease prevention. So I'm going to move on to the next section of the talk, which is how much physical activity do we need? Now, just before this, I had dinner with some of the faculty, and we were talking about different guidelines that have occurred throughout the years, and it is true that guidelines have been placed in front of us throughout the years, and they have changed somewhat because of the different evidence-based. So the guidelines I'm going to highlight are our most recent federal physical activity guidelines, and these are public health guidelines. So some of you may have heard about this in 2008. In 2008, the federal government put forward comprehensive federal guidelines for the first time. In the past, we did have guidelines from organizations such as American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, but this is the first time that the government had sort of put together a comprehensive set of guidelines. These guidelines have been used in many countries throughout the world, and in fact, the World Health Organization in 2010 put out a document that was similar in many aspects to what the federal government had in 2008. So you might think, that's a long time ago, are new guidelines going to come out? And yes, these guidelines are in the process of being updated. They'll probably be released in late 2018. But as for now, what do the guidelines say? So the guidelines were essentially divided into three parts. One for children and adolescents, one for adults, and one for older adults. I'm going to focus on the guidelines for adults because this is what most of the population is, and the guidelines are similar for older adults, but they do make allowance for the fact that older adults may have chronic diseases, and therefore they may not be able to do physical activity to the level or intensity that is recommended. So what do the guidelines say? The guidelines say that aim for 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity physical activity, such as brisk walking, or 75 minutes a week of vigorous intensity physical activity, such as jogging, or a combination of the two kinds of activity that expend equivalent energy. And they also ask for us to do strength training exercises on at least 2 days of the week. And further, the guidelines say that if you want to get even more benefit, do more than that. Double that amount. So 300 minutes a week of moderate intensity physical activity, or 150 minutes a week of vigorous intensity physical activity, or some combination of the two that expends equivalent energy. So you might ask, what is moderate intensity physical activity? Well, moderate intensity physical activity may not be a level that, for example, older adults or individuals who are compromised might be able to achieve. So the guidelines are actually very encouraging in that when they set out the 150 minutes or the 300 minutes, they also made pains to say that some physical activity is better than none, and adults who participate in any amount of physical activity will gain health benefits. So what is the moderate intensity physical activity that the federal government wants us to try to aim for? If you look at the general adult population, so young adults to, say, adults probably around the age of 64, 65 or so, the technical definition of this is 3 to less than 6 METs, and a MET is a multiple of resting metabolic rate. So if you're sitting quietly like you are, listening to me talk, you're expending 1 MET. If it's the end of a long day and you're snoozing in your seat, you're probably expending 0.9 METs. I'm standing here and waving my hands a little bit, I might be expending 1.5 METs. A brisk walk might get you 4 meds. And if you go for a jog at a 10-minute mile or 6 miles per hour, that would be about 10 meds. So to give you some idea of what some of the high meds are, say the Boston Marathon, the top runners, the ones who win the marathon, might be exercising at the rate of something like 22, 23, 24 meds. So, okay, this is good and fine, but when we talk to the general population, you start talking in meds, you might as well be talking Greek. Patty might understand Greek, but nobody else here will understand Greek. So what is moderate intensity? I sometimes tell people that let's think about this as the sing test. What do I mean by the sing test? So when you exercise moderately, you can feel your heart rate going up. You can feel maybe you might get a little bit out of breath. You might start sweating a little. You can still talk and carry on a conversation with a friend, but you cannot sing. If you, I'm sorry. So you can still, if you are exercising at a moderate rate, you can feel your heart rate go up. You can carry on a regular conversation, but you don't have enough breath so that you can sing a song. If you cannot talk and you cannot sing, you are exercising at a vigorous rate. You're exercising very hard. If you can both talk and you can sing, you're not exercising at a moderate level, but you're exercising at a light level. So this is what I call the sing test. Cannot sing, moderate. Cannot talk, vigorous. Can talk and can sing, you're probably exercising at a light level. And what counts? So when we talk about physical activity recommendations, many times people think, oh, I don't have time to go to exercise. How can I meet the 150 minutes? This is a lot of time. But through the different studies that we have, we are increasingly beginning to realize that the energy that you expend doesn't have to be in exercise time. What you do in leisure, what you do as part of your occupation, what you do as transport and commuting to and from work, what you do as part of your household chores, they all count. But they have to be at least moderate in intensity. That is, you can feel your heart rate going up, you can feel yourself maybe getting a little bit out of breath. And we say 150 minutes a week, and technically you could do it as a weekend warrior, all 150 minutes on one long hike or 2 shorter hikes. But ideally, we would like you to spread it out throughout the week. Why do we want you to spread it out throughout the week? First, you are less likely to get musculoskeletal injuries. And secondly, if you do it throughout the week, it becomes more a lifestyle, something that you're used to doing as opposed to something that you have to consciously do. So we would like for you to spread it out throughout the week, and we say that the bouts of physical activity have to be at least 10 minutes in duration. Now, we say 10 minutes in duration because at the time of the 2008 guidelines, the studies that were available had data on the shortest bouts, so probably about 8 to 10 minutes each, and there was no evidence at that time on these new kinds of training programs. Some of you may have heard of high-intensity interval training that are very, really short, but of high intensity. So the guidelines may change with the next iteration, but at least for now, we say that it has to last at least 10 minutes in duration. So this talks about physical activity in terms of a time duration. Technology has evolved, and many of you probably have one of these wearable devices that track steps. And in fact, one of your professors in the Department of Kinesiology, Dr. Greg Weld, does a lot of research in terms of these wearables, how accurate they are, how they perform relative to each other. And these wearables tell you, you can look at them and see, how many steps you've accumulated throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. And many of you have heard about 10,000 steps, right? So we all here said we should get 10,000 steps a day. Do we really need to get 10,000 steps a day? What is the history of the 10,000 steps? So it turns out that The 10,000 steps was a goal that was put up by the inventor of the pedometer. The inventor of the pedometer is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Hatano, and he's Japanese. And he said, I think 10,000 sounds like a good number. Why? Because 10,000, the Japanese character for 10,000 is this, and it looks like a man walking. So he said, 10,000 steps, this is what one should be doing. So which is why 10,000 steps comes into our lexicon. And as it turns out, 10,000 steps may or may not be correct depending on which country you live. What do I mean by that? So let's look at the US. In the US, how many steps does the average population take? The average man or woman in the US takes about 4,000, 5,000 steps a day. So if you take the average person and you put them on an exercise program, you watch them do the exercise program such that they fulfill the 150 minutes a week, they would take maybe about 16,400 extra steps a week. So let's divide that by 7, assuming that you get that all evenly. That comes out to be about 2,300, 2,400 steps a day. So the average person takes 5,000 steps a day. If you do the extra to meet the recommendations, you add another 2,000. So it turns out that for us in the US, you actually do meet recommendations by taking 7,000 steps. If you can do 10,000 steps, fantastic. But 7,000 steps is all it takes in this country to meet recommendations. So going back to Dr. Hatano, it turns out that he actually was, by lottery luck, correct. Because in Japan, people walk more than they do here. In Japan, the average number of steps taken is about 7,000, 7,500 steps. So if you added the 2,300 on top of that, you come up with the 10,000 number. So he actually turned out to be correct for Japan, but maybe not so for the US. So 10,000 steps, great if you can make it, but if you make 7,000 steps, this is sufficient to meet recommendations. So let's move on to the last part of the talk. And I'm going to talk about what evidence there is to show that physical activity reduces the risk of our chronic diseases. It's pretty much taken for guaranteed now that if you're physically active, your health will improve. I'm pretty sure that there are very few people, maybe as many people as who will say smoking is absolutely harmless, who will tell you that physical inactivity doesn't hurt you. But it wasn't always this way. Our way of thinking has changed a bit over the last 50, 60, 70 years. If you go back earlier, say maybe 50 to 80 years ago, you'll see something like this. This gentleman, Henry Ford, said, exercise is bunk. If you're healthy, you don't need it. And if you're sick, you shouldn't take it. Of course he'd say that. He made motor cars. He wanted you to buy more cars. So why have we changed our opinion? We've changed our opinion primarily because of these two pioneers in the field. So this is Professor Jeremy Morris. He was a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and this is Professor Ralph Paffenbarger over in the United States. So Professor Jeremy Morris, he's old enough that he served as a doctor in the British Army in the Second World War, and this was like in the 1940s. When he came back to England, he found that there was a new epidemic. And what was the epidemic? It wasn't flu, but there was an epidemic of heart disease. Rates of heart disease were going up much higher than they used to be. And he had this theory that, things were getting more mechanized. People could afford to buy cars. Fewer people were walking, and that was probably why heart disease rates were increased. So in some of the pioneer studies, what he did was, I thought, really brilliant, because what he did was he took a group of individuals who all were almost exactly the same except for the amount of physical activity. And these were the people in the London bus transport company. So they were paid about the same amounts, which meant they probably lived in the same areas, they smoked to the same amount, they probably ate the same amounts of food. The difference was that in London you had these double-decker buses, so the drivers sat and drove, and the conductors collected your bus fare, they walked up and down the bus, they went up and down the stairs. And he hypothesized that these conductors, because of the activity they did on the job, would have lower rates of heart disease than the drivers who sat all day. And he studied them and he found that indeed the conductors had about half the heart disease rates compared to the drivers. And so he did this work early on, and about 10 or so years later, Professor Ralph Paffenbarger started a study. He was my advisor. He started the Harvard Alumni Health Study, where he took a group of Harvard alumni and he looked at their exercise habits. So what they did when they were college kids, what they did during middle age, and he essentially confirmed the same findings that Professor Jerry Morris did, that individuals who are physically active had lower rates of heart disease than individuals who are inactive. So this was during the 1950s and 1960s. So today, it's now 60 years later, we have a large body of evidence, hundreds of studies that show clearly that if you're physically active, you have a whole range of health benefits. You live longer, you have lower rates of heart disease, you have lower blood pressure, you have lower rates of stroke, you have less cardiometabolic disease, less type 2 diabetes, you have lower rates of, in particular, breast cancer and colon cancer, you are less likely to be depressed, you are less likely to fall. Physical activity also improves your cardiorespiratory and your muscular fitness. You have better body composition, you have better bone health, you're able to function better in the older age, like either Keeling and Roger Gentino, and it also improves your cognitive function. So what I'm going to show you next are some representative large-scale studies that pool together data so that I hope to convince you that you see a large body of evidence showing that physical activity at the levels that are recommended reduce your rate of chronic diseases, and even better, remember the guidelines say some activity is better than none and any amount of physical activity will benefit health. And I hope to show you or convince you in these studies that even if you don't get to the guidelines, you will still improve your health relative to the people who do nothing. So we will review, in the interest of time, we will review the data for the most common chronic diseases that kill us. We'll look at premature mortality, we'll look at heart disease, and we'll also look at type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes increasing in incidence, partly because of the obesity epidemic, and also because type 2 diabetes is a very important risk factor for heart disease. If you have type 2 diabetes, your risk of getting a heart attack is as high as someone who's already had one heart attack. So we'll look at type 2 diabetes and we'll look at cancer. So we'll look at premature mortality, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. So if you're physically active, you will live longer, whether you're a man or a woman. These are some data from a pooling project that I was involved in, and I'll walk you through this slide. It's a pooled analysis conducted by a group of investigators that included 6 large studies in Europe and in the United States, pooling together data from more than 660,000 individuals. And these individuals were followed for a long time. On average, in the studies, they were followed over a period of 14 years. So what I'm going to show you are, these are, essentially, we can think of them as the rates of mortality during the period of study. Now, of course, everybody dies, but it's how early you die. So this is how high the death rate was during the period of study. So the higher up on this chart, the higher the death rates are, the lower the death rates are. And on the x-axis, I plotted levels of physical activity according to a metric that we call met hours a week, but you don't have to worry about that. Here, and I think it's probably not showing up too clearly to you, we plotted it instead according to what the physical activity recommendations are. So at this point, it is 1 to 2 times physical activity recommendations, 2 to 3 times physical activity recommendations, and so on, up to this point where it's more than 10 times physical activity recommendations. So at this point, you meet physical activity recommendations. What do you see? We see that going from nothing to meeting physical activity recommendation gives you a sharp drop in mortality rates. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the data that you see here. You'll see these little dots and you see these whiskers. So what are they? Now, when we're scientists, we never tell you that anything is 100%. We'll tell you what our best estimate is. These are our dots, and these whiskers tell you what our 95% uncertainty range is around that estimate, which means that if you see short whiskers, you're fairly confident of the estimate. If you see large whiskers, it means that the data are sparse in that area and you're not as confident in the estimate. So what are a few points to highlight? The first thing is that the more you do, the better off you are. Second thing I wanted to point out, and very importantly, yes, when you get to physical activity recommendations, your rates of mortality do go down, but even before you reach this level, if you did only half, your mortality rates are 20% lower than those who didn't do any activity. The more you do, the more benefit you get, but it's sort of diminishing returns, because from here to here you see a large reduction, from here to here a lesser reduction, and you get even lesser reductions. Now at this point, a lot of people have said, oh, does it mean that it's harmful to do too much physical activity? I don't think so. Now granted, there is a point beyond which physical activity likely is harmful. You can't be doing a triathlon every day of the year and still be a normal, healthy being. But what that upper limit is, I don't think is so clear. So remember I said that if you look at the whiskers, the longer the whiskers, the less certain you are about this estimate. So this estimate, rather than this dot, it could be as low as here and it could be as high as here. So in other words, I'm not very confident about the results at this point. But I do know that if you do some physical activity, you're better than none. If you meet guidelines, you're even better than the people who did half. If you did double the recommended level, the 300 minutes a week, which is the second level of recommendation, you get even additional benefit and even more as you go along this chart. So I tell you, you reduce your risk of dying, and you think, oh, that's really abstract. What exactly do you mean by that? So this is a chart that I think is a very nice chart that the magazine from my university put up. It's based on data from the previous study, but at an earlier point in follow-up. So where individuals have been followed up for only about 10 years as opposed to 14 years. And what this chart does, it shows the amount of walking and the years of life that you might gain from walking. So you probably don't see this too clearly, but this is 200 minutes a week of walking, this is 400 minutes of walking, 600 minutes of walking. Or if you choose to run, 200 minutes of walking is about equivalent to 100 minutes of running. 400 minutes of walking equivalent to approximately 200 minutes of jogging, 600 to 300. Now, those of you who are studying exercise physiology are going to come up to me and say, no, that's not quite correct. It depends on how fast you run. But think about it in broad terms, because walking can mean different speeds, but in broad terms. So this is, say, brisk walking, and this is, say, let's say, running, jogging at about 6 miles per hour. So again, what do you see? You see that if you meet guidelines, which is 150 minutes a week, wow, you gain almost 3 years of life compared to someone who does nothing. And this is 3 years of life from the age of about, say, mid-50s, because the individuals in this study, when they got started, on average, they were in their mid-50s to late 50s. So compared to someone who does no physical activity, you gain almost 3 years of life. But what if you did a little bit less? If you did even, say, 75 minutes of walking a week, which is half of what is recommended, you gain about 1.8 years of life. So going from doing nothing to doing a little bit, you still gain, and as you do more, obviously you gain more years of life, such that the person who's doing 600 minutes of walking or 300 minutes of running will gain more than 4 years of life compared to someone who's inactive. So let's talk about sitting. We've all heard about sitting, right? I'm sure you've seen recent reports that say, oh, sitting is really bad for you. So you see things like this, killer chairs, killing is the new smoking, it's going to kill you. But some of us don't have a choice. Many people who commute long distances on public transportation have to sit for long hours at work. Some of us have desk jobs, and we might not have the luxury of being able to not sit. You can't say, I choose my job because I want to be physically active. I think very few people would do that. There are some people who might have the luxury of deciding this. But for those of you who say are teachers, want to go to the dock and start unloading containers, I don't think so. It's harder work, and it also doesn't pay as much as teaching does. So sometimes you can't choose this. So what we wanted to do recently is, this is published online a couple months ago and in print just last week. We wanted to look and say, okay, say suppose you had to sit a lot. You didn't have a choice. Is there anything you can do about it? And the answer is yes. You can offset some of the harms of sitting by being physically active. So again, I'm going to walk you through this slide. It's a very busy slide. What we have here is, again, these dots, and think of them as rates of death. The higher the dots, the higher the death rate. And here what we have are individuals grouped by levels of physical activity. So these are the most active people. They're active for about 60 to 75 minutes a day. So they're active at a moderate intensity for 60 to 75 minutes. And these are the least active people. They're active for less than 5 minutes a day. So in the least active, let's go back a bit. So within each of these activity categories, there are different levels of sitting. The ones on the left are the ones who sit the least, less than 4 hours a day. The ones on the right are the ones who sit the most, at more than 8 hours a day. So the first thing you note is that the least active people, all of them, regardless of their sitting level, clearly have a higher death rate compared to the individuals who are physically active. But then within each of the activity categories, if you're someone who is very inactive, even if you sit very little, you are badly off. You sit more, you're terribly off. But what if you're someone who's very, very active? Statistically, none of these dots are different. So essentially, among those who are physically active at 60 to 75 minutes a day, you can sit for more than 8 hours a day and not increase your death rate. Now, of course, again, not everybody can reach this level. But even if you are active at this level, and this level is probably about 50 to 60 minutes a day, you still mitigate your risk of sitting somewhat. And this is about what current guidelines are. You're still better off than the people who do essentially nothing. So sitting is bad for you, but by being physically active, you can mitigate some of the increased risk associated with sitting. So let's now look at heart disease. Physically active men and women have lower rates of heart disease. So again, I'm going to show you a pooled analysis. These are some data done by a doctoral student of mine. And what he did was he pooled data from different studies. So all the light bars you see are individual studies. And as scientists, what we do is we don't really believe in the findings of one study. What we want to know is the consistency of evidence. And he looked at all these different studies and plotted kind of, you could say, the average finding across all the different studies. And this, again, shows pretty much what we see with the mortality rates, which doesn't surprise you, right? Because heart disease is one of the major killers, one of the main causes of death in the US. And what you see is, from doing nothing to doing a little bit, your heart disease goes down. This is where you meet guidelines. The more you're willing to do, the lower your heart disease rates. And this is another study that was done by one of my fellows, and it's a single study, not data from several studies, but I think it's really encouraging because what it does is it looks at rates of heart disease among women in our women's health study of different weights. So these are the normal weight women, these are the overweight women, and these are the obese women. And what you see are rates of heart disease plotted by women of different weight groups, going from the most active women to the least active women. And what you see is, yes, if you're normal weight, your heart disease rates are better than someone who is overweight or obese. But even if you are obese, if you are someone who is physically active, these are the front two bars, you are better off than your colleagues who are inactive, which are the back two bars. So physical activity benefits individuals of all shapes and sizes. If you are someone who is already heavy, it's very hard to lose weight, but you can still be physically active. Going to move on now to the next disease, which is physically active men and women have lower rates of type 2 diabetes. Now, this is not a new study, but it's a really important study. It's from a trial called the Diabetes Prevention Program trial. So what it is was, it was a multi-center trial. It involved participants from 27 centers throughout the United States. And what the investigators did was they enrolled 3,234 overweight or obese men and women who had impaired glucose tolerance. So it meant that these people couldn't process glucose normally, and they would be at high risk of developing diabetes. What they did was they randomized these group of individuals to 3 groups. So one group was the placebo group, and the placebo group took a placebo, essentially a sugar pill. The second group took a drug called metformin, which is a drug that we use to treat diabetes. And the last group was assigned to an intensive lifestyle intervention program that encourage people to lose 7% of their body weight through physical activity and a sensible diet. So what you see here is the years as the trial goes on, and what these lines are were, okay, all these people had no diabetes. They were at high risk of getting diabetes, but they did not yet have diabetes. And as they developed diabetes, you plot it in the graph, so over time, more and more people develop diabetes. So as you might expect, the individuals in the sugar pill had the highest rates of diabetes. But what was, I would say, shocking, even for the investigators who believed that physical activity and diet would be important, was that the lifestyle group did better than the drug group. At the end of the intervention, the lifestyle group had a 58% reduced risk of developing diabetes, and the drug group had 31% reduction in risk. Even the most converted of us weren't expecting this rate. I think we might have expected that they might do equally well, or maybe the drug group will do slightly better. So you might say, oh, well, you know, this is only 3-4 years. What happens after that? Last year, the investigators published a finding after 15 years of follow-up. And what happened was that you essentially still see the pattern, the same pattern. The sugar pill had the highest rates, the drug group still had a higher rate, and the lifestyle group was the group that did best. So in this particular example, it's a combination of diet and physical activity. I'm going to show you another pooled analysis. So this is a combination of data from 10 different studies looking at different levels of physical activity and rates of developing diabetes. So these are not individuals at high risk of diabetes, but the general population. And you can see what we saw as for all-cause mortality and heart disease rates. Do some, you get some benefit. When you reach the guidelines, you get a significant amount of benefit. The more you're willing to do, the greater your benefit. So we're getting close on time. I'm going to end up with the last disease condition I want to talk about, which is that physically active individuals have lower rates of certain types of cancers. So when I showed you the guidelines from the 2008 physical activity guidelines, we said that active individuals had lower rates of breast and colon cancer because these are the more commonly occurring cancers, and there weren't much data for some of the other cancers. Some of you may have seen this in the newspapers about a month or 2 ago. So this is a study that we did again. We tried to pool data from 12 different studies so that we would have large groups of individuals. And what we found was that physically active individuals had lower rates of 13 different types of cancers. So not just breast and colon cancer, but many different cancers, including some of the more common cancers we have, such as endometrial cancer, bladder cancer, liver cancer, cancers of the esophagus and the gastric cardia, liver, and so on and so forth. If you're interested, I've provided the reference here, and you can see all the different cancers that are on this site. I'm not going to spend more time going to them, other than to say that if you're physically active, you can reduce your rates of many different cancers. So I'm going to stop now and summarize what we've talked about in the last period of time. We know that in the US, chronic diseases are the leading causes of death. We talked about what the recommended levels of physical activity are. And we clearly see that what is recommended will reduce our risk of developing many chronic diseases. But encouragingly, if we do some physical activity, even if it is less than what is recommended, we still get benefits for chronic disease prevention, which is why I think physical activity should be labeled a wonder drug. And I'm going to close by showing you this card that my secretary found for me, and it says, walking shoes are $80, and if you go to a discount store, they're probably even cheaper than that, which is where I buy my shoes. A triple bypass, 80 grand. And if you go to the more expensive centers, it can go up to $250,000. Think of all that cash in hand and march your tush along the land. So be physically active, and thank you for listening to this lecture.